The moment someone tells you they can rewrite nature with a bulldozer, they've already written the first chapter of their own disaster. The first thing I noticed wasn't the noise. It was the smell. Freshly torn earth has a damp, mineral scent that hangs in the morning air, and that smell reached my front porch before I ever saw the excavator. Then came the metallic rattle of steel tracks crawling across my orchard, followed by the deep groan of hydraulic arms peeling away decades of carefully shaped ground like it was nothing more than a pile of loose dirt. I dropped my coffee before I even reached the front gate. My name is Ethan Walker, and this story is completely fictional, but if you enjoy slow-burning justice stories where arrogance collides with patience, you're in exactly the right place. My family's orchard sits on just over 60 acres outside a quiet Oregon town. To most people, it's rows of apple trees stretching toward the hills with gravel lanes, weathered fences, and an old red barn that has survived more winters than I can count. To me, every inch of that land carries a memory. Every tree has a number. Every irrigation ditch has a purpose. Every shallow depression in the soil exists because someone in my family understood that water always remembers where it wants to go. That morning, however, strangers were carving a brand new trench straight through the eastern section of my orchard without asking a single question. I stopped beside the survey stakes and stared as another apple tree leaned sideways before settling into the dirt with a soft crack of roots letting go. The leaves trembled in the breeze. Dust drifted through the sunlight. Diesel exhaust mixed with the sweet scent of early summer fruit, creating an odor so wrong it made my stomach tighten. A woman wearing spotless white boots stepped away from a black luxury SUV and folded her arms like she was inspecting a landscaping project instead of someone else's property. Victoria Sterling, president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. Perfect hair, designer sunglasses, the kind of smile that looked rehearsed long before it reached her face. She barely glanced at me before pointing toward the trench. Community drainage improvement, she said with absolute confidence. Your orchard happens to be in the most efficient path. Efficient. That single word echoed louder than the excavator. I asked whether she had permission to cross my land. She answered by holding up a rolled set of engineering drawings without offering them to me. Our consultants handled everything, she replied. You'll actually benefit from this. Benefit. I looked beyond her shoulder and watched muddy water begin slipping into a channel that had never existed yesterday. Something about its direction felt deeply wrong. Most people see a ditch. I see elevation, slope, pressure, years of seasonal runoff. My grandfather taught me to read moving water before he ever let me drive a truck. Standing there, I realized these contractors weren't simply digging a trench. They were cutting across a living drainage system that had quietly protected this valley for generations. Victoria noticed me studying the ground instead of arguing with her. She smiled wider, probably mistaking my silence for surrender. She had no idea silence can be the loudest warning an engineer gives. I watched another bucket of soil swing overhead as sunlight flashed across wet clay. Birds that normally nested along the orchard edge had already disappeared. The breeze carried the distant sound of sprinklers from the neighboring subdivision, followed by children's laughter somewhere beyond the trees. Everything looked peaceful. Everything sounded ordinary. But beneath my boots, the land was already trying to tell a different story. Victoria thought they had redirected a drainage ditch. What she didn't know was that they had interrupted something far older than any HOA, any subdivision, or any set of glossy development plans. And once water is forced away from the path it has trusted for decades, it never forgets who moved it. I did not argue with Victoria because experience had taught me that people who confuse confidence with competence rarely listen until reality interrupts them. Instead, I walked the length of the fresh trench one slow step at a time while the excavator continued carving through soil that my grandfather had spent decades understanding. The workers were simply following the colored flags planted by a survey crew. They were not the villains in my mind. They were doing the job they had been hired to do. My frustration rested entirely with the people who believed a computer-generated drainage plan could replace generations of local knowledge. I grew up believing that an orchard was more than rows of trees. My grandfather, Harold Walker, used to wake me before sunrise every Saturday with a mug of hot chocolate waiting on the porch and a folded topographic map tucked beneath his arm. Before I was old enough to understand geometry, he was teaching me why rain never truly falls at random. He would kneel beside shallow channels barely 6 inches deep and tell me that every inch of elevation mattered. During winter storms, we would stand beneath old cedar trees listening to water moving beneath layers of fallen leaves. He said the land was always speaking. Most people simply never learned its language. When I finished college with a degree in civil and water resources engineering, friends assumed I would leave for Portland or Seattle to chase larger projects and taller buildings. Instead, I came home. Some people thought I had wasted my education running an orchard. They never realized the orchard itself was one enormous engineering project disguised as agriculture. Beneath the grass stretched carefully graded swales. Hidden beneath gravel lanes were drainage tiles installed nearly 50 years earlier. Small stone spillways slowed runoff before it reached the lower creek. Every apple tree benefited from a system that looked natural because it had been designed to disappear into the landscape. That was my grandfather's greatest lesson. Good engineering does not demand attention. It quietly prevents disasters that never make the evening news. As I reached the eastern fence line, I noticed something that made me stop completely. The fresh trench crossed an old strip of darker soil where my grandfather had once buried a line of perforated drainage pipe after a record storm flooded neighboring farms back in the early 1980s. I remembered helping him replace sections of that pipe when I was 15 years old. He had laughed while handing me a muddy wrench and said, "Someday someone will think they know this land better than we do. Keep your records, because memory fades faster than paper." Those words echoed through my mind as clearly as if he were standing beside me again. I hurried toward the barn, climbed the worn wooden stairs to the loft, and unlocked an old steel cabinet that smelled faintly of machine oil, cedar, and yellowed paper. Inside sat dozens of carefully labeled binders filled with surveys, drainage sketches, weather journals, permit applications, and handwritten notes dating back more than 4 decades. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight as I laid the oldest maps across a workbench scarred by years of honest labor. Outside, the rumble of heavy equipment continued without pause. Inside, another sound slowly replaced it in my thoughts. It was the quiet certainty that every answer I needed had already been left behind long before anyone from the Homeowners Association ever imagined building their subdivision beside my family's orchard. The oldest binder carried a faded label that simply read East Watershed, and the moment I opened it, the familiar scent of aging paper and graphite filled the loft. Inside were contour maps hand-drawn by my grandfather, engineering notes from the county dating back more than 40 years, rainfall records, and page after page of observations written in careful block letters. He documented everything: snowpack, soil conditions, creek levels, even which sections of the orchard stayed damp 2 days longer after unusually heavy spring storms. As I spread the maps across the workbench, I noticed something the subdivision engineers had completely overlooked. The drainage route they had carved through my orchard crossed 3 separate natural collection areas before reaching the lower basin. Those shallow depressions looked insignificant to anyone standing on the ground, but on paper they connected like links in a chain. Remove one connection, and the entire flow pattern shifted somewhere else. I grabbed my field notebook, walked outside, and began comparing the old survey markers with the freshly disturbed soil. The excavator had already cut nearly 400 feet across the eastern block. Fresh clay glistened beneath the afternoon sun, while muddy water slowly trickled through the unfinished trench. I crouched beside the edge and watched a floating leaf hesitate before changing direction. That tiny movement confirmed what the map suggested. Water was already abandoning the route my grandfather had designed decades earlier. Victoria drove past in her sport utility vehicle just as I finished taking measurements. She rolled down her window with the confidence of someone convinced the discussion had already ended. She reminded me that their engineering firm specialized in modern residential developments and assured me the project would improve drainage for everyone in the community. I simply nodded and thanked her for the information. She looked almost disappointed that I was not arguing. Confidence often grows louder when nobody challenges it. I returned to the barn before sunset and compared every page in the binder with current county parcel maps stored on my laptop. The property boundaries had changed over the years as neighboring farmland became subdivisions, but one feature had remained untouched. A narrow drainage easement recorded decades earlier still crossed the edge of my orchard before continuing toward protected wetlands beyond the neighborhood. More importantly, every approved drainage modification referenced that original route. The new trench ignored it entirely. It was designed for convenience rather than the natural watershed. I leaned back in my chair and listened to rain tapping softly against the metal roof as clouds gathered over the hills. The forecast called for a steady storm arriving within 2 days. Nothing severe, just the kind of ordinary Oregon rainfall nobody paid much attention to. I traced the contour lines one more time with my finger, following the elevations exactly as runoff would travel. The answer became impossible to ignore. The subdivision itself had been built safely because earlier engineers respected the existing drainage network. The new shortcut disrupted the balance without replacing it with anything equally reliable. That realization changed everything. This was no longer about damaged trees or trespassing equipment. It was about a system that had quietly protected hundreds of acres for generations. I closed the binder carefully and placed it back on the workbench. Outside, the last excavator finally shut down, leaving the valley wrapped in an unfamiliar silence. For the first time all day, I was no longer wondering whether the homeowners association had made a mistake. I was wondering how long it would take before they realized it themselves. By sunrise the next morning, I had already scanned every map, copied every permit, and organized my grandfather's records into neat folders on my desk. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the faint scent of old paper while rain clouds gathered over the western hills exactly as the forecast had predicted. I believed facts would solve the problem. I believed that once the county reviewed the documents, someone would tell the homeowners association to stop digging until everything could be verified. I was wrong. My first call was to the county planning office. The woman who answered listened patiently while I explained the situation, then transferred me to a stormwater coordinator. He reviewed the permit number I provided and confirmed that the subdivision held an active drainage modification permit. When I explained that the excavation crossed my orchard and ignored an older drainage easement, he sighed before answering. He told me that disputes involving overlapping records often required a formal review and could take several weeks before inspectors reached a conclusion. Several weeks. I looked out the window toward the fresh trench slicing across my orchard and knew the excavators would finish long before any paperwork caught up with them. I drove into town carrying copies of every survey I had found and met with a licensed surveyor named Daniel Pierce, a man my grandfather had respected for years. Daniel spread the maps across his conference table and studied them in complete silence. Every few minutes he adjusted his glasses and compared one drawing against another. Finally, he looked up and nodded slowly. He agreed that the historical drainage records appeared consistent and that the old easement had never been formally removed. Unfortunately, confirming its present legal effect required additional field verification and county approval. He could prepare a professional report, but not before next week. Next week felt impossibly far away. That afternoon, I visited the construction office beside the subdivision entrance. Pickup trucks filled the gravel parking lot, while workers carried rolled blueprints in and out of temporary trailers. Victoria greeted me with the same polished smile she always wore, as though every conversation had already been scripted in her favor. I placed copies of the historical maps on the table between us and calmly explained why the new trench concerned me. She barely glanced at the documents before sliding them back across the table. According to her consulting engineers, the project satisfied every modern requirement. She even suggested that older drainage designs often became outdated as communities expanded. I thanked her for her time, gathered my papers, and walked away without raising my voice. Behind me, I could hear cheerful conversations, reversing alarms from construction equipment, and the steady hum of generators powering another full day of work. Nobody there sounded worried. Nobody believed anything could possibly go wrong. By late afternoon, fresh gravel had already been spread along sections of the trench, while drainage pipe waited beside the excavation, ready for installation. I stood beneath one of the oldest apple trees still untouched by the machines and watched dark clouds drift lower across the valley. The wind carried the smell of approaching rain along with the distant rustle of leaves moving through the orchard. Every expert I contacted agreed that reviewing the records would take time. Time was the one thing the landscape no longer had. As the first cool drops landed on the dusty ground, I finally accepted something my grandfather had understood long before I was born. Sometimes proving you are right begins with allowing the land to reveal the truth on its own. The rain arrived exactly when the weather service predicted, gentle enough that most people would have called it a pleasant Oregon afternoon. I stood beneath the porch roof watching thin streams of water slide across the orchard exactly as they had every season of my life. Nothing looked dramatic. Nothing looked dangerous. That was the deceptive thing about watersheds. They rarely announced a problem with noise. They whispered it through small changes that only became obvious after hours of patient observation. I pulled on my rain jacket and walked toward the eastern edge of the property carrying one of my grandfather's laminated contour maps inside a waterproof folder. Fresh boot prints from the construction crews had already begun filling with muddy water. The newly carved trench flowed steadily, but something immediately caught my attention. Instead of spreading runoff across the orchard the way the original system had been designed, the water accelerated through the artificial channel, picking up speed every few yards. It was behaving exactly as the old engineering notes warned against. I followed the trench until it reached the property line where new drainage pipe disappeared beneath the subdivision access road. A temporary junction connected the unfinished system to a permanent stormwater line leading into Maple Ridge. The connection looked clean, modern, and professionally installed. Unfortunately, it also ignored nearly every contour line my grandfather had documented decades earlier. I returned to the barn and opened another binder that I had overlooked during the first search. Inside were inspection reports from county engineers who had visited the orchard after an unusually wet winter nearly 30 years earlier. One paragraph stopped me cold. It explained that the eastern retention swale existed to slow runoff before releasing it downstream, because rapid discharge could overwhelm lower collection areas during ordinary seasonal storms. Attached to the report was a signed maintenance agreement acknowledging that future property owners were expected to preserve the natural drainage sequence. Folded behind the agreement was an even older survey showing the original easement extending beyond my orchard toward land that would not become the subdivision until decades later. My grandfather had highlighted one sentence in yellow marker. Any alteration redirecting concentrated surface flow outside the approved drainage corridor required written county authorization and updated hydraulic calculations. I compared that language with the permit documents available through the county website. The subdivision approval referenced the historical drainage corridor but never included revised hydraulic calculations for abandoning it. Instead, the new design treated the orchard as though it were simply another empty parcel rather than the centerpiece of an interconnected watershed. Suddenly, every conversation I had endured over the past 2 days made perfect sense. The county employees believed the approved plans reflected the existing drainage network. Victoria believed her consultants had permission because the permit itself appeared valid. The consultants likely relied on incomplete site information. Everyone assumed someone else had verified the details. Meanwhile, the land continued following the same physical rules it had obeyed for generations. I spread every document across the workbench until the entire history of the valley surrounded me in overlapping layers of paper. Rain tapped steadily against the barn roof while a cool breeze drifted through the open doorway carrying the scent of wet apple leaves and fresh earth. For the first time since the excavators arrived, I was no longer searching for answers. I had found them. The question was no longer whether the system had been changed incorrectly. The real question was how to restore the original drainage path legally before the next significant rainfall exposed exactly why those forgotten records had existed in the first place. The next morning, I drove back to the county office before the contractors even started their engines. The parking lot was still damp from the overnight rain, and the cool air carried that clean scent that always follows a steady shower. I walked inside carrying a stack of maps, inspection reports, easement records, and every document my grandfather had preserved. This time I was not asking anyone to stop the construction. I was asking a much simpler question. If the original drainage easement remained legally active, what rights did I have to restore the historical flow on my own property? The county engineer assigned to the counter spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing the paperwork. He compared parcel numbers, historical surveys, and maintenance agreements while occasionally disappearing into another office to retrieve archived records. Finally, he looked at me and said something that completely changed my approach. He explained that nothing in the existing documents prevented me from maintaining or restoring the original drainage features located entirely within my own property boundaries, provided I did not excavate beyond the recorded easement or violate environmental regulations. In other words, I did not need permission to preserve what already legally existed. I thanked him, requested written confirmation of the applicable maintenance standards, and left with copies of every relevant regulation. There would be no shortcuts, no secret construction at night, no dramatic confrontation. Everything I planned would be documented, inspected if necessary, and completed exactly according to the law. Before returning home, I stopped at Daniel Pierce's office once more. He had already finished preliminary field measurements and confirmed that the original swale could still function if restored to its documented grade. We walked through the survey together, discussing elevations, runoff velocity, and the location of several old stone check structures hidden beneath years of grass. Daniel smiled and said my grandfather had built a remarkably elegant system because it relied on the landscape instead of fighting it. Hearing those words felt like receiving advice from the past. Back at the orchard, I spent the afternoon marking the original drainage alignment with biodegradable flags based entirely on the historical surveys. The faded stakes my grandfather had driven into the ground decades earlier still appeared beneath patches of moss and tall grass exactly where his notes predicted. Finding them felt less like discovering something new and more like greeting an old friend who had quietly waited for someone to remember. A local excavation company agreed to perform only the limited restoration work shown on the historical plans after reviewing the documentation. Their owner insisted on photographing every stage before touching a single shovel because he wanted a complete record of compliance. I appreciated that more than he probably realized. By evening, the equipment sat quietly beside the orchard, waiting for work to begin with the sunrise. Across the valley, I could see fresh houses glowing beneath porch lights while the new drainage trench disappeared into the subdivision exactly as Victoria intended. She probably believed the disagreement had ended because I had stopped visiting the construction site. In reality, I had simply stopped arguing and started following the only authority that mattered. The maps, the records, the surveys, and the law were finally pointing in the same direction. All that remained was to guide the water back to the path it had trusted for generations and allow the landscape to do exactly what it had always been designed to do. The restoration began just after sunrise beneath a sky the color of polished steel. The air felt heavy with moisture, and every blade of grass shimmered beneath tiny drops left behind by the night fog. I walked the excavation crew along the flagged route one final time before a single bucket of soil was moved. Every measurement matched the historical surveys. Every adjustment stayed inside the recorded easement. We were not creating anything new. We were simply uncovering what had been quietly waiting beneath decades of grass and fallen leaves. As the first sections of the original swale reappeared, smooth layers of rounded river stone emerged exactly where my grandfather's notes said they would. Even the excavation foreman stopped for a moment and shook his head with quiet admiration. He told me he had spent 30 years working construction and had rarely seen a drainage system built with such patience. By early afternoon, the restored channel curved naturally through the orchard once again, guiding runoff toward the same retention basin that had protected the valley for generations. We photographed every stage, recorded elevations, and documented the completed work before the equipment left the property. I emailed copies of the survey updates and maintenance records to the county that same evening, making sure there would never be any question about what had been done or why. Across the fence, construction inside Maple Ridge continued as though nothing had changed. Fresh landscaping crews spread decorative mulch around newly planted shrubs, while sprinklers sprayed perfectly trimmed lawns. Victoria drove past twice that afternoon, slowing just enough to glance toward my orchard before continuing without stopping. Whether she noticed the restored swale or simply assumed I had given up, I could not tell. By sunset, the weather forecast shifted. A broad Pacific storm system was expected to move inland overnight, bringing several inches of steady rainfall across the county. Nothing unusual for Western Oregon. Local news stations treated it as another routine storm, reminding residents to drive carefully and clear leaves away from neighborhood storm drains. I finished securing my equipment before darkness settled across the valley. The orchard looked peaceful again. Water already collected gently inside the restored channel instead of rushing through the artificial trench that had scarred the eastern field only days before. Standing beneath the old cedar tree near the barn, I listened to frogs calling from the lower basin while cool winds stirred the apple branches overhead. Everything felt strangely calm. Shortly after midnight, the rain intensified. Not violent, not frightening, just steady and relentless. From my kitchen window, I watched water glide through the restored swale exactly as the historical drawings predicted. It slowed across the retention area, spread naturally through the orchard, then continued downstream in a controlled flow. The system was doing precisely what it had been built to do decades earlier. Then my phone buzzed on the counter. One neighborhood social media notification became 3, then 8, then more than 20 within minutes. Residents from Maple Ridge were posting photographs of standing water covering neighborhood streets, overflowing landscaped islands, and parking areas filling faster than storm drains could empty them. Emergency vehicles were not racing through the subdivision because there was no dramatic catastrophe, only crews closing flooded sections of roadway, while public works employees inspected drainage inlets that could not keep up with the redirected flow. I set the phone down and looked back toward the orchard. My fields remained exactly as they should have been, quietly absorbing and guiding the rainfall one careful contour at a time. For the first time since this entire dispute began, the land itself had become the only witness whose testimony nobody could argue with. Morning arrived beneath low gray clouds that still clung to the valley, and the smell of wet cedar drifted across the orchard as sunlight slowly reflected off puddles scattered between the apple trees. My fields looked exactly as they always had after a healthy Oregon rain. The restored swale carried a gentle ribbon of clear water toward the retention basin, and every section performed precisely as the historical surveys predicted. My phone, however, had not stopped vibrating since before dawn. News helicopters circled above Maple Ridge, while local traffic reports warned drivers to avoid several neighborhood entrances because standing water covered portions of the internal roads. Public works crews inspected catch basins, while county stormwater officials photographed drainage connections throughout the subdivision. None of it happened because of an extraordinary storm. It happened because an ordinary storm exposed an extraordinary mistake. By mid-morning, I received a call from the county engineer who had reviewed my documentation earlier that week. His voice sounded noticeably different from our first conversation. He asked if he could visit the orchard immediately with 2 inspectors and a representative from the planning department. Less than an hour later, 3 county vehicles rolled slowly down my gravel lane. We spent nearly 4 hours walking the restored drainage corridor, comparing my grandfather's original surveys with current elevations, collected by modern equipment. Every measurement matched within acceptable engineering tolerances. The inspectors carefully examined the restored swale, photographed the exposed stone check structures, and reviewed the maintenance agreement preserved inside my grandfather's records. One inspector quietly admitted he had never seen such complete historical documentation maintained by a private property owner. When we reached the eastern property line, the discussion shifted toward the subdivision. The inspectors traced the artificial trench leading away from my orchard before comparing it with the approved drainage plan stored in the county database. One of them frowned as he realized the constructed alignment differed from the historical hydraulic assumptions referenced inside the original permit package. Nobody accused anyone of intentional wrongdoing. Instead, they began asking careful questions. When had the design changed? Who verified the revised flow calculations? Where were the updated hydraulic reports supporting the modified discharge route? Those questions echoed through the afternoon while more county vehicles arrived at Maple Ridge. Across the valley, I watched Victoria speaking with engineers beside stacks of rolled blueprints. Even from a distance, I could tell the confidence she wore only days earlier had disappeared beneath the weight of unexpected scrutiny. This was no longer a disagreement between neighbors. It had become a technical review supported by maps, surveys, permits, inspection records, and physical evidence visible on the ground. Over the following days, temporary barriers redirected traffic while contractors inspected stormwater infrastructure throughout the subdivision. Independent engineers requested copies of my grandfather's records because they contained watershed observations extending back decades before the development existed. Daniel Pierce's final survey confirmed that my restoration work remained entirely within the recorded easement and complied with existing maintenance requirements. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. The valley had never failed. The original drainage system had never failed. The only failure came from assuming that decades of accumulated knowledge could be replaced without fully understanding why the landscape had been shaped that way in the first place. Standing beneath the oldest apple tree at the edge of the orchard, I listened to water moving quietly through the restored channel and realized something my grandfather had always believed. Nature does not argue, negotiate, or seek revenge. It simply follows the path that careful hands and honest judgment allow it to follow. 2 months later, the valley looked exactly the way my grandfather would have wanted it to look. The orchard was alive with the soft rustle of apple leaves. Bees drifted lazily between blossoms, and the restored drainage swale blended so naturally into the landscape that most visitors walked past it without realizing it was one of the most carefully engineered features on the entire property. That was always the point. The best engineering disappears into the land until the day someone removes it. County officials eventually completed their review, and the final report confirmed what the maps, surveys, and decades of observation had quietly demonstrated from the very beginning. My restoration work remained fully consistent with the historical easement and documented maintenance requirements, while the subdivision drainage modifications required significant redesign before they could operate as intended. Contractors returned over the following weeks, this time under careful county supervision. Temporary drainage lines were removed, revised grading plans were approved, and new hydraulic calculations were completed before additional work continued. The process took time, but this time every decision followed documentation instead of assumptions. I crossed paths with Victoria only once after the investigation concluded. She stood near the community entrance watching survey crews place fresh markers along the roadside. Gone was the confidence that had accompanied her polished presentations only weeks before. She walked toward me, glanced across the orchard, and quietly admitted that she had trusted reports without ever asking how the land actually worked. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, just an honest acknowledgement that confidence without understanding can become surprisingly expensive. I accepted her apology because holding on to anger would never improve a watershed. We spoke for only a few minutes before going our separate ways. That conversation ended more peacefully than our first one had begun, and somehow that felt appropriate. Later that autumn, Daniel Pierce stopped by the orchard carrying copies of the finalized county survey. We stood beneath the old cedar tree where my grandfather used to explain contour lines with nothing more than a walking stick and a handful of damp soil. Daniel smiled as he folded the survey into its protective case and said something I will probably remember for the rest of my life. He told me that most people believe land belongs to whoever holds the deed, but experienced engineers know that water recognizes only gravity and good design. Looking across the orchard, I realized every lesson my grandfather taught me had finally come full circle. He never tried to control nature. He learned its patterns, respected its limits, and built systems that worked with the landscape instead of against it. That quiet philosophy protected our family long after he was gone. Every faded notebook, every weather journal, every carefully preserved permit had become another voice speaking when he no longer could. This story is fictional, but the lesson behind it feels timeless. Knowledge patiently preserved will always outlast arrogance built in a hurry. The orchard remained exactly where it had always been, rooted in careful planning rather than pride. The water continued following the path it had trusted for generations, not because anyone forced it to, but because the land had finally been allowed to remember its own design. And as I closed the old steel cabinet one last time, I ran my hand across the worn binder labeled East Watershed and smiled, because justice had never arrived with shouting or revenge. It arrived quietly, one contour line at a time, proving that the strongest foundation is not built on power. It is built on patience, truth, and the wisdom to let the land speak for itself.